In Chapter 13, we're going to start looking at the macroeconomy. So we're going to look both at long-run growth, right, which we talked about in Chapters 1 and 2, and also the business cycle, the ups and downs of the economy. So far in a lot of, even in this class, we've looked at more about what individuals have done. And these decisions both are impacted by the macroeconomic conditions, but also impact those conditions themselves. And so we're going to look at how households and firms respond to these economic conditions and what indicators we use to measure those economic conditions. So macroeconomics really wasn't born until the Great Depression, when we realized we didn't really have good measures of the total economy. And so one of the first things that the government did was to start putting together national accounts, which we'll talk about in this chapter. So we're going to talk about the size of the economy, right? We're going to talk about gross domestic product. We're going to talk about how households try to smooth their consumption when their income is going up and down. We'll talk about firms' investments decisions and the fact that investments very different from consumption. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about inflation. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we have our chapter on monetary policy. So one reason to care about unemployment is that unemployment obviously means that you don't have your income, but it also causes a lot of stress, right? And so this is just a graph of the unemployment rate change from 2007 to 2010 during the Great Recession, and the change in the Google Stress Index. So basically, how often people are Googling, things that indicate that they are experiencing more stress. And so you can see, if we had another explanatory variable, some of these states that are outliers experience some of the biggest bubbles in their real estate markets. And so that would be another reason for stress in this period that's obviously related to the Great Recession. Growth in the long run, so this is UK GDP per capita. We'll look at the US in a minute. You can see that both on a linear scale on the left and a log scale on the right, GDP per capita started increasing pretty significantly in the second half of the 19th century and then increased even more rapidly after World War I. And so it went from about a 0.9% increase per year to over a 2% increase per year. There's something called the rule of 70, which is helpful in understanding how different growth rates lead to different long-run outcomes. And basically, the rule of 70 says that if you take 70 and divide by the percent growth, then you get the number of years it will take to double. So if something is growing at 7% per year, then it doubles every 10 years. And so if we think about an economy like China, they've been experiencing growth rates of at least 7%, meaning that every 10 years, GDP per capita has been doubling. If something is growing at 2% per year, then 70 divided by 2 is 35%, 35 years. And so that's what we see in the UK since the end of World War I. And so GDP per capita in the UK and in a country like the United States has been doubling approximately every 35 years. So the business cycle is basically what happens in the ups and downs of the economy. So we saw in the last graph that even though we had experienced really significant growth in GDP per capita, it's not a completely smooth process, right? And so we have ups and downs both in terms of GDP growth and also in terms of the unemployment rate. So the graph on the left here gives us the GDP growth rate and unemployment rate for the United Kingdom. And the business cycle is the term that we use to explain and describe these ups and downs in terms of GDP growth and unemployment. So you can see that, for instance, in the UK, the unemployment rate hit about 15% during the Great Depression. It was actually much higher in the United States, around 25%. They had very low unemployment after World War II, up until the sort of early 80s, where they had another bad recession, as did the United States. And since then, it's been bouncing around between sort of 6 and 8%. GDP growth rate sort of has been averaging around 2%, as we said, but with a lot of ups and downs, right? And so the recession is when unemployment is going up and GDP growth is usually negative. So here is the real GDP per capita of the United States. You can see it shows a similar picture to that of the UK. This one only goes back to 1947. But you can see these ups and downs. So now whenever you're looking at a graph like this, these gray bars in the graph represent recessions. And so these recessions are dated by a group called the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's a non-governmental organization of economists. And they basically look at the data for real GDP growth, for unemployment rates, and decide when a recession has begun and when it has ended. So you can see that GDP tends to be going up during expansions in the white part of the graph and then down in recessions. Overall, the trend has been up, right? GDP per capita, adjusting for inflation, right? These are chained real dollars, has gone from about $14,000 per person per year in 1947 to about $52,000 per person per year in 2016. If we look at the unemployment rate, we can see again that the unemployment rate goes up during recessions and then comes down during expansions. And so we've seen that we don't have the Great Depression here, and so our scale only goes up to 11%. But if we did have the Great Depression, it would be much higher, about 25%, as I said. The unemployment rate now is pretty low. It is, below 5%, which is usually considered a good thing. But it's not the only measure of the health of the labor market, and there are a lot of economists that think right now the labor market is not as healthy as you might think based purely on the unemployment rate. If we put the two together, we can see the beginnings of what we're going to call Okun's Law, which we'll come back to in just a minute. And the idea basically with Okun's Law is that when uh, the unemployment rate is going up, GDP growth is going down, and when GDP growth is going up, the unemployment rate is coming down. So they have an inverse relationship. And that's more true in some economies than others, but it tends to be a fairly stable relationship in most industrialized economies. Now, one thing that I want to make clear is that calling it the business cycle is not really the best term, right? It's not something that we can predict really well. It's not a regular cycle. And recessions can have different causes, right? So some just recessions are driven by changes in wealth. Some are driven by financial crises. Some are driven by oil price shocks. And so it's not something that we can predict really well. That said, every expansion we've had so far has been followed by a recession, and every recession that we've had has been followed by an expansion. So coming back to Okun's Law, what these graphs do is to graph the change in the unemployment rate on the vertical axis and real GDP growth on the horizontal axis. And so all it is a scatter plot with different years for different countries. The US is here in the middle on the right. And it gives us a measure of the relationship between the two, just running a very simple linear regression, and then gives us a measure of R squared. So if you're not familiar with statistics, R squared basically ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 says there's no relationship between the variables, and 1 says that there's a perfect relationship between the variables. They all line up on a straight line. So you can see that in the United States, Okun's Law is actually pretty strong. The R squared is 0.64, and as opposed to a country like Japan, where it's much weaker and the R squared is 0.16. Japan does not see a big change in the unemployment rate, sort of no matter what GDP growth is, and part of that is because of a different relationship between employees and employers. And then finally, we can talk about Okun's coefficient, which is the degree of correlation, right? So how much the unemployment rate changes due to a 1 percentage point change in GDP growth. So for the US, you can see it is minus 0.38 approximately. For Japan, right, which is much flatter line, it's just minus 0.03. Malaysia is more similar to Japan. Spain is more similar to the United States. But the United States seems to have one of the stronger Okun's coefficients, as well as having one of the larger R squared. And so this is one of the things that we see, especially in this country, with recessions is that when GDP growth shrinks, we see a big increase in the unemployment rate. And then as GDP growth picks up in the expansion, the unemployment rate comes down.